This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
From blockbuster movies to hit TV shows, a chunk of the entertainment you're tuning into gets made here in Canada. But only some of it gets marked as being Cancon. What is that?
Cancon, abbreviated, I don't know. I've heard of it, but I actually have no idea what it is.
Cancon is Canadian content. Recently, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission held this hearing.
Our goal is clear: to modernize the definition of Canadian content to reflect today's reality.
The CRTC recently released its much-anticipated decision on Canadian content, Cancon, which is the first of two decisions that could reshape broadcasting and film and television production along with internet regulation in Canada. At a minimum, the two decisions, the second will involve the question of the mandatory contributions and discoverability obligations of internet streamers, will have a profound effect on those streaming services that operate in Canada. Now, the CRTC promoted its approach as injecting new flexibility into the Cancon system, but the fine print matters, and some of the changes may be more restrictive than they appear at first glance. To help make sense of the decision, I'm joined this week by Len St-Aubin. Len is the former Director General of Telecommunications Policy at Industry Canada and played a role in the development of both the Broadcasting Act and Telecommunications Act. He provided consulting services to Netflix until 2020, and he's been an active participant in the debate on internet policy as part of the Canadian Internet Society. Len, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Michael, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you've come on to join. You've been so involved in broadcast Canadian content rules for any number of years, both in government, years later as a consultant, now I know on the policy committee of the Internet Society. And your perspective is really valuable, I think, looking at the question of the CRTC and its somewhat new approach to Canadian content. And so for those that don't know, the CRTC recently released its much anticipated decision on Cancon. It's really the first of two decisions that I think could reshape broadcasting, film and television production in Canada, and certainly at a minimum, it's going to have a significant impact on internet streamers because that second decision, which in some ways really does work together with the first, focuses on what their mandatory contributions ought to be. So there is a lot to unpack with this most recent decision. And I'd like to tackle it, I think, in three stages. First, a little bit on the background that led to this, and then we can talk a bit about some of the key elements in the decision. And then, of course, really want to get into a bit of your analysis about what works and what might not. But why don't we start first with the background? I think there's many people who have heard of Cancon, certainly listeners to this podcast, probably more than the average Canadian, but nevertheless, I think it's useful to start with a bit of an explanation of what are these Canadian content or Cancon rules, and also importantly, what role does the CRTC play when it comes to establishing them?
You're right, there is a whole lot to unpack here. And I think up front, I wanted to just make a few points. With the Online Streaming Act, the CRTC is going to be regulating foreign online streamers for the first time. It's just never been done before. So, companies like Netflix and Amazon and Disney, they'll all be required to finance Canadian content. Now, I don't disagree with that. In fact, a lot of these companies have already been doing some of that. And production industry in Canada has grown significantly as a result over the last 12 years. And they've been spending on Cancon as well as on, productions for their global consumption. So the question really is, how do you redefine what's Canadian in that broader context? That is really no longer just domestic, but we're talking about a global marketplace. Also, a couple of things to clarify up front, because I think there's been some confusion about that. This decision is really only about audiovisual content, stuff related to music streaming and sound recording. That's going to come later. And also, as you hinted at there, distinction about what the commission does here with Cancon quotas. This is not at all, has nothing, zero to do with accessing public funding or public financing. And some people get that mixed up because there are different ways of defining CanCon. For the CRTC, this is really just about defining it for its own regulatory purposes. How much companies have to spend on CanCon. So what does that mean? What does CanCon mean? When it comes to public financing, that's different organizations completely. That's the Canada Media Fund and the Canadian Audiovisual Certification Office, and they control access. That latter controls access to the Canadian Film and Television Video Production Fund. Now, the reason I want to mention that up front is that it's important to recognize that what the Commission has done here has nothing to do with public financing, and we'll get into that a little later.
That's really useful. Let's drill down just for a second a bit more on that so that people fully appreciate this distinction, because I think oftentimes that notion of CanCon is used sort of in a universal way. But as you just described, there's a CRTC version of CanCon that's for regulatory purposes, and there is this CAVCO, so to speak, version. And I take it that's where the issue around financing, public funding comes into play.
Yes, that's right. Both CAVCO, which is access to tax credits, the generous Canadian content tax credit. And then there's also the Canada Media Fund, which is direct financing. And that's only accessible by independent Canadian producers. So you combine those things together. And the last time I was looking at this, it was probably around 2023, and about something close to 45% of the financing for a given Canadian content show comes from public sources. So it's significant.
Okay, so there's a lot of money at stake to qualify for the CAVCO definition, not so much with respect to the CRTC definition, though that CRTC definition becomes very important once we start getting into a world of the CRTC beginning to regulate streamers and thinking about what their contributions might look like.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay, it's good to unpack that because I don't think that's often as well understood. Well, why don't we talk then more specifically, I guess, about the CRTC's related CanCon rules. We'll talk a bit about the changes they're proposing, but first, let's think about what the standard has been. What are the core elements to qualify as Canadian content? And I think notably, especially in a CRTC context, but it could apply otherwise. What do you see as the policy objectives here? For those that follow this issue, at times there's discussion around this is fundamentally about so-called telling Canadian stories. Sometimes it seems that it's more about employment in the sector, Canadian jobs, and sometimes there's an intellectual property component, Canadian ownership of the IP. And so I'd love for you to touch both on what the core elements of CanCon are, but then also a bit on what is, at least from the regulator's perspective, what do we understand the policy objective here is?
Until this decision, Michael, the CRTC, the CMF, and CAVCO all started from the same 10-point scale. That scale requires that a certain percentage of the key creative positions in a production, things like the director, screenwriter, designer, actors, and others, be filled by Canadians. So the CRTC always required 6 out of 10 points. For access to public financing, CAVCO, they also went with the 6 out of 10, but they added on top of that ownership of copyright in the production. It had to be Canadian. CMF went even farther. They said, okay, they need 10 out of 10 points. Again, we're talking about the same key creative positions, the same 10 points. They want 10 out of 10 plus copyright ownership. Now, they've always been more stringent, and there is a kind of logic to having more stringent requirements if you're talking about access to public financing. So there's a logic there. They all require as well that 75% of expenses be paid to Canadians. So, the majority of the money on a Canadian production stays in Canada, gets paid to Canadians. Now, you're right. In many respects, this looks like and amounts to a classic industrial policy. It's about jobs for Canadians, spending in Canada, and intellectual property ownership. The assumption is that stories told by Canadians, made by Canadians, are Canadian stories. But the criteria have never made any mention of Canadian elements, such as Canadian characters or based on a Canadian story or locations, none of that. So that's how we end up with some oddities, which you have highlighted in some of your columns, about shows that are certified as Canadian but don't look like Canadian, like, for example, the Tudors or the Borgias, while others that really do look Canadian, like the Quebecois film The Decline, just aren't. They don't get certified as Canadian.
Yeah, I know that aspect of the CanCon rules have been, I think, a source of frustration at times. And as we'll come to in a minute, the CRTC moves a little bit towards addressing this issue of so-called Canadianness, although I think there are some issues there, and I'm sure that we'll get to it. So it's good to understand that there's sort of a bit of a spectrum here, and the requirements as you, in a sense, seek something more funding or more or tax credits, that invariably seems to lead to some additional requirements. Now, the changes that we're seeing are specific to the CRTC, of course. What sparked the decision to re-examine the set of Canadian rules? And to give it away, I mean, it's quite, as many will know, it has to do with the Online Streaming Act, Bill C-11. What did that law require in terms of dealing with this question?
Well, yeah, you're right. This whole review was prompted by the passage of C-11, the Online Streaming Act. It amended the Broadcasting Act to capture online streamers under CRTC regulation. There was some doubt as to whether the act previously did capture them or not. Some folks thought it didn't. Others thought it did. Now it's clear that it does capture that. So the act authorizes the CRTC to define CanCon as part of its regulatory framework, but then it also, a policy direction ordered the CRTC to revisit the current framework and gave it some suggestions as to things that it might want to consider in that context. So in response, the CRTC launched a string of proceedings. They imposed on streamers what they called a base contribution of 5% of gross revenues in Canada, and that would go to a variety of funds to support CanCon. And that's being challenged to some extent for a variety of reasons, because some of the relations between, it's not so much the 5% as where the money's going if you're a streamer. Then this proceeding is revisited the definition of Canadian content. And the next one that you referenced is going to be the one that really decides what percentage of revenues in Canada that broadcasters and streamers will have to contribute to financing CanCon above and beyond that initial 5%. Now, that it already has been a very controversial question, as you can imagine, polar positions.
No, it's been a big issue, and clearly that, in some ways, that will be the biggest of these various outcomes from the CRTC
That'll be the big shoe to drop. Yeah.
I think that's right, and so everyone is kind of waiting for it either towards the end of this year, although we're kind of almost at the end of this year, but it more likely early next. So you mentioned the hearing that the CRTC held specific to this issue of CanCon. Can you describe a little bit before we get to the point of, well, what did they actually determine, or what the outcomes of this, what kind of positions did it take at the start of all of this, and notably, what were some of the kinds of things that it heard from the various participants who participated in that hearing?
The commission started off with some proposals to redefine CanCon with a view to making it a little more flexible and a little more attuned to the current environment where there are foreign players very active in Canada, already producing and competing directly with Canadian broadcasters. So they proposed broadening the point scale from 10 to 15 points. So introducing new creative positions to be considered and how they interact with global productions, for example. They also asked some open-ended questions about copyright. Should they take it into account? If so, how should they take it into account? Should streamers be able to produce CanCon themselves, or should they have to go through Canadian parties of one kind or another? Now, of course, foreign streamers wanted the greatest flexibility and the least regulation possible. Canadian producers and Canadian broadcasters, on the other side, they wanted foreign streamers to be regulated just like Canadian broadcasters. And for Canadian producers especially, ownership of copyright has been a very big concern. It's an interesting question, copyright, and we'll get to it later. But in a world of global streaming, once you've partnered with a global streamer who has global rights to a production, I don't know what more you get from it by holding the rights yourself. I mean, you hold the rights to generate revenue from them. Once you've generated the revenue on a global scale, can you get more? It used to be you could because you sold them in Canada and then you sold other markets separately. Well, that's not so much anymore.
A good preview for an issue that we could get into with respect to the copyright rules and in just a few moments. Before we do that, though, why don't we talk a bit about what the CRTC has done, or a bit more about what the CRTC has done with respect to greater flexibility, because it comes in a number of different forms. You mentioned this expansion of the list from 10 to 15. Can you talk a bit about what's been added? And there are, I think, a couple of categories that, at least in some of my discussions, have attracted some attention and some amount of concern about the practical effects of all of this. That includes the introduction of a new category for so-called showrunner, and another that addresses, as we were talking about earlier, this notion of Canadian character, Canadian settings, sort of the Canadianness, so to speak, of the production itself.
They have tried to make things more flexible, but then they introduced some more problems. On the one hand, they have expanded the point scale from 10 to 14. That's for live action. It's a little different for animation. I think they've expanded there to 15 points. For live action, they've included the showrunner, as you mentioned. They've also included costume, makeup, hair, and visual effects positions, for example. So a production can meet the points requirements with different combinations from a broader range of creative positions being filled by Canadian. So there's flexibility for smaller scale productions, for example. If you don't have the full scale of 15 positions, then you go with the positions that you have, and you're looking for a majority of Canadians filling the positions that you have. There's some flexibility for situations where, particularly in international productions, co-productions, the same position may be filled by both Canadians and non-Canadians. For example, in different episodes in a series. You might have a different director, you might have different costume folks, you might have whatever. So that kind of, it kind of takes into account that kind of flexibility. They've also introduced what they call bonus points. And as you've been talking about, these apply if, for example, 50% or more of the pre-recorded musical selections are Canadian. So that gets to these Canadian elements. If a script is based on or derived from a Canadian literary work, for example, or the production is based on Canadian characters or settings. So these are bonus points that don't change if the total is for your production is, say, 12 or 14 or 15. These points don't change that number, but they can add to your to the assessment of whether it's Canadian or not. So maybe, you need 6 out of 10, you've got 5 out of 10, but you've got a story based on a Canadian script, a lot of Canadian music, and the production is set entirely in Canada. Maybe that's enough to get you over the line. In theory, those bonus points can make a difference. But the problem is that the CRTC has prescribed these elements so narrowly that they can be difficult to attain for a lot of productions. So, for example, if a production's music is more than 50% pre-recorded Canadian music, it won't count if the production's music composer is non-Canadian. So there are little, twigs like this that make what appear to be something useful, maybe not as useful in real life. For the setting bonus points, for example, the story must take place entirely in Canada. Well, if it's based on a Canadian novel and you're moving around from across the world or whatever, how many stories are based solely and entirely in Canada? And also, to be certified as Canadian, the production company must be Canadian owned and controlled, and the copyright must be at least 20% owned by Canadians. And that's where we start to see some more problems, and we'll talk about that soon.
Yeah, I want to get to the copyright in just a sec, but just to drill down just a little further on some of these categories and sort of the fine print, so to speak, on some of them. You've highlighted at least A couple. I know in the showrunner context, one of the concerns there is that my understanding is that the showrunners typically play a significant role in script writing. I mean, that's a big part. They've often will have it. This is common in television shows now to or series to have a showrunner. They are deeply involved in many instances in some of the script writing. Yeah, my understanding is that the category itself limits the number of episodes that the showrunner can have written in order to qualify for this showrunner category or these points for the showrunner category, which suggests that you've got a definition of showrunner that doesn't really reflect what a showrunner is and therefore won't really move the needle very much in many instances.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, Michael. When you look at the submissions filed with the CRTC, there were different views on what the showrunner role actually is. And I think it's fair to say that the role probably varies a lot. Some claim that it's basically a writer who takes on a broader range of responsibilities for oversight of a production and connecting all the various functions together. Other people will see the role as having overall creative control of a production. So there's a bit of a spectrum there, and the commission recognized this, but they decided that the position was of growing importance, which I think is true. Within their point system, they defined the role in a way that does, as you say, limit its role as a writer, because they wanted to make a distinction between, on the one hand, the writer is a key creative position that ought to be recognized in its own right, and then the showrunner. So if you're going to recognize the showrunner, where they came down is the showrunner's role ought to be more than a writer. And how do you slice and dice that? Not easy. And sure, no matter how you do it, you're going to remove some flexibility, and that's where it gets problematic.
Okay, interesting to see how that played out. I mean, it's the same is true. I think you made reference to it a moment ago with respect to the Canadian characters and settings. I had someone make reference to "Come From Away," the enormously popular Canadian production that, of course, played successfully on Broadway and elsewhere. Recounting what took place in Gander, Newfoundland on 9/11. And yet, of course, there are many characters there that are not Canadian. There are elements there that are that it's a quintessential Canadian story, and yet the story involves many non-Canadians, which again raises this question: if you narrowly define this to the extent that it starts excluding things that, by most accounts, I think people would see this as Canadian, what exactly are you accomplishing?
Well, Come From Away is an interesting example. Remember that the Canadian characters or literary work and setting elements, those are bonus points. They're not determinative of whether the production is Cancon right away off the bat. They're not part of the 15 key creative positions that are the kind of bedrock starting point. So the production would need to meet enough of those other key creative position points to be certified Canadian as an audiovisual production anyway. I'm not sure if there is an audiovisual production of Come From Away yet, but no doubt there will be. So let's just kind of parse that one out. It's possible that a movie version of the play might get bonus points for being based on a Canadian play, because it would be. It's a Canadian story, it's a Canadian play, it's based on a Canadian literary work. So that's one bonus point, probably. I'm not the decider here. It might also get a bonus point for being set entirely in Gander, Newfoundland. The show, I've seen it a couple of times, it doesn't move out of Gander. That's where it is. So that's arguably a bonus point. But you're right, many of the main characters are Americans stranded in Gander. So that bonus point might not apply. But on the other hand, if you're doing that production, you're likely going to have Canadian director, Canadian screenwriter, Canadian Canadian lead actors. You're going to probably do your best to meet all of those other points that add up to where you want to go. And if you don't get the benchmark, then you've got the setting and the script that might help you get over the line.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I mean, I guess the point is that, at the sort of the top line story here is the addition of these new categories, greater flexibility, and then this question becomes, well, once you start getting into the question of applying it,
Yeah.
especially around the bonus points, that there's a restrictiveness to the application of some of these bonus points in a way that actually may limit their utility, I think is where at least I'm
Yep.
hearing some of the concerns. There may well be similar kinds of concerns, and I know you've highlighted this around copyright. You've already made reference to it a couple of times, so why don't we go there?
Sure.
You started off by noting that copyright was not a part of what the CRTC required, though is an element that you get within the CAVCO and CMF rules. Suddenly now we do see copyright brought in. Can you describe what the CRTC has in mind, the flexibility or lack thereof when it comes to invoking the copyright elements within these new standards?
Yeah, well, this is one area where the decision is actually less flexible than the CRTC's criteria used to be. They never used to require Canadian ownership of copyright. Now, under the new rules, they're going to require at least 20% of ownership of Canadian ownership of the intellectual property in a production. And the other thing that they've done is that the greater the foreign ownership above that 20%, the more burdensome the other Cancon criteria become. Let me give an example. A production that is 100% copyright owned by a Canadian broadcaster or independent producer needs to meet 60% of the Canadian content point scale to be certified Canadian. So 60% of the key creative positions have to be filled by Canadians, and you get the points. And some positions are worth 2 points, most are worth 1, but you have to add up to 60% if the production is owned by Canadians. If a production is more than 50% owned by a foreign streamer or foreign entity, it has to meet 80% on the point scale, plus additional requirements ensuring control of the Canadian production company. There's a difference there. 60% versus 80% on those key creative positions, and maybe you get some bonus points if you're lucky. It's not a distinction without a difference. It's a real difference. And I come back to saying, this has nothing to do with accessing public financing. The CMF and CAVCO requirements are on top of that if you want to get public financing. So for foreign streamers, the CRTC's Cancon criteria are every bit as strict as CAVCO's to access Canadian film and TV production, the tax credit. But the CRTC offers zero access to financing. So not really clear to me why the Commission went down this route, but it does have some problematic outcomes.
Why don't we continue for a bit there? You said you don't really know why they're doing this, but do they explain why they're doing this? Because I mean, based on what you're suggesting, copyright ownership was just not viewed as necessary from a regulatory perspective up until this point. Suddenly, and part of the rationale may well have been that you're not accessing public funds, and so the copyright ownership was not as relevant a criteria. Suddenly now you find yourself having to meet copyright ownership rules whether or not you're accessing public funds. I mean, that, not to jump the gun, but when I start thinking about some of the trade related issues and concerns that we've seen arise in the context of this bill and or this law and the United States, this notion of being required to meet certain conditions and having restrictions on your ability to own what you invest in without taking any sort of public money might well capture the attention of certainly the USTR, if not others.
Yeah, well, you're anticipating a later discussion, but yes, I think what happened here is that part of what happened is that until the Commission starts regulating foreign streamers, its job in terms of certifying Canadian content related almost exclusively to content produced by Canadian broadcasters, because the other content, the fiction, the drama, the more expensive content that broadcasters are required to finance through independent producers, that content always had access to public financing through CAVCO or the Canada Media Fund. And, those two organizations did their own certification and they required copyright. Now, if the commission is looking only at, and primarily, if not only, at news and sports and game shows and reality TV produced by licensed Canadian broadcasters, well, they're licensed Canadian broadcasters. They have to be Canadian owned and controlled anyway. The content they produce and own themselves is owned by Canadians. So it probably just was not a requirement. It wasn't even something I had to think about much. But once they start having to certify content made by foreign entities, well, that's when they start hearing from the Canadian producers and the broadcasters, look, copyright's important here. And I think that's where, that's how this got into the mix.
Before we get to your thoughts on the decision, one last piece from the decision that's worth just highlighting for people, and that has to do with the data disclosure requirements that are now included. What do those include, and are they likely to raise any concerns?
Yeah, I think they will. And the real problem, Michael, with the data disclosure requirements is that the CRTC has predetermined upfront that the information will require from streamers and broadcasters to file will now be made public. And this includes annual Canadian gross broadcasting revenues, less whatever revenues are excluded, Canadian production expenditures, and other contributions to Canadian content. Now, up until now, broadcasters and streamers have been able to file information with the CRTC, label it confidential, and request that the data not be made public. Now, in response to that, the CRTC has always had the authority to hold a public hearing and determine whether it's in the public interest to release that data that's been called confidential. But unlike in the past, where streamers have been able to retain confidentiality, what the commission is saying now is, no, we're telling you upfront, what we're asking from you is going to be made public. Canadian broadcasting is a relatively small universe. There aren't that many players. There are some group owners and things like that. But if you're looking at global streamers competing around the world, their argument is that, look, our situation is really different. It might be possible, for example, for our competitors to extrapolate data from one market to estimate global information. And that's why they want the ability to keep it confidential. And I don't have enough information to know how reasonable that concern is, but my guess is, based on their approach to data and confidentiality in the past, my guess is this is going to be a sticking point for them.
Okay, interesting. Not something that people have paid as much attention to. Of course, the stuff that really gets the attention tends to be the content side and the categories and points and the like. But this data issue may have business implications that may raise some issues. Okay, yeah. That's a really helpful summary, not of everything, but of some of the stuff that I think a lot of people are paying attention to. What's your overall take? I mean, you've given some hints about some of your concerns and views, but what's your overall take of the CRTC's approach?
Well, Michael, I think the main issue that I see with this decision is that at a time when the CRTC is sweeping foreign streamers into Canadian content regulation, they have just made their framework for defining Canadian content more stringent for foreign streamers than for Canadian broadcasters. And you see that, I mean, as I've mentioned, discussed throughout this interview in various locations. In fact, the decision goes so far as to say that programs produced solely by Canadian broadcasters and Canadian online streamers like Crave will be recognized as Canadian without formal certification. For most broadcasters, as I said, they meet about 70% of their Cancon spending requirements with in-house news, sports, games, and reality. But for others, like Bell's streamer Crave, well, they produce drama and comedy, just like foreign streamers do. But there's no such presumption of compliance for foreign streamers. The Canadian broadcasters benefit from this presumption of compliance that doesn't apply to foreign streamers. By contrast, foreign streamers can't even produce or own any of the content that they will be required to finance. So they're being told, look, you have to produce this intellectual property. You have to spend money in Canada, subject to all of these Canadian criteria. You can own up to 80%, but the more you own, the higher the more burdensome the implications for you. So they'll face very different criteria for their mandated content. As I said, they can't produce or own any of it themselves. They have to work with and finance the production through an independent Canadian producer at a third party. The Canadian producer has to own at least 20% of the copyright. And as I said, the more the foreign streamer owns, the higher the burden. So, and all of that without any access to public financing. As you hinted, from the perspective of our trade commitments, I think streamers may well argue that this looks like discriminatory treatment. Canadian broadcasters benefit from a presumption of compliance. They have a lower burden for certification. But from a public policy perspective, I have some concerns too. You know, I see this as a lost opportunity to try and promote and incentivize more commercially financed, market-oriented, audience-driven Canadian productions. Unlike Canadian producers, foreign streamers really don't need the CMF and the Cancon tax credit. I mean, sure, they like them. You know, if you can get access to them, why not? But they have the means to finance Cancon on their own for global audiences. And theirs is a totally different business mindset from Canadian broadcasters. For streamers, the CRTC framework had the potential to be a more flexible way to gain Cancon certification for content that the CRTC requires them to finance and that they might be prepared to finance on their own with just the standard industrial tax credits that are available to any video production in Canada. That means, so I mean, without public Cancon financing. Now, I don't know if that's real, but the possibility is gone. Because, you know, if it's every bit as burdensome to get Cancon certification without access to public financing, well, you know, you might as well go for the public financing. It's just natural human behavior.
We've sort of alluded already a little bit to some of the trade related stuff. You know, my takeaway from your description is that there are issues that are likely to be sources of concern for the streamers. You mentioned some of the data side, perhaps some of the lost flexibility, but there may ultimately be the ability to adapt to all of this as well. So, you know, where do you think this leaves us in terms of how they operate? Is it also just waiting for the other shoe to drop in terms of seeing what the other obligations might be? And is there the prospect that this, like I suppose the digital services tax a number of months ago, might elevate to the point where it becomes a trade issue with the U.S.?
First of all, the only recourse for streamers in terms of this decision is to ask the CRTC to reconsider aspects of its own decision or to challenge the decision in the courts. And I think they have about 30 days to do that. Under the Broadcasting Act, this decision cannot be appealed to Cabinet, to the Governor and Council, because it does not issue, amend, or renew a license. So that avenue is off the table. So we may well see appeals to both the CRTC and the courts at the same time. Meanwhile, the follow-up decision is coming down probably early in the new year, and that'll determine the percentage of Canadian revenues that streamers and broadcasters must spend. So that's where the rubber really hits the road. I mean, if you've got burdensome requirements and they only apply to a small percentage of your revenues, that's not as big a problem as if they apply to a proportionally much larger share of your revenues. The CRTC is under a lot of pressure to go much higher than, say, 10% or 20%. And if this decision is any indication, there may well be more challenges on the horizon. All of this is happening while the government is dealing with and negotiating tariffs with the U.S. Whatever the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately decides on Trump's current tariffs, that will not apply to any potential retaliatory measures under our free trade agreement. If the US decides that it's very unhappy with the CRT's treatment of US streamers. So if I were an American streamer, I would be looking to have some discussions with the US, the Office of the US Trade Representative.
Certainly never a dull moment. A really important decision with some significant implications, but as we've been saying, there are some other elements that are yet to come into play that will give us at some point a fuller picture of the implications for streaming services in Canada and some of the political reaction. Len, it's complicated stuff, and there's an important background and history that's essential here too. And you're one of the rare people who can bring all of that to the table. So thanks for the work that you do on these issues, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Michael. Good to talk to you.
That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbytes@pobox.com. That's LAWBYTES @POBox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBytesPod or follow Michael Geist @MGeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe at iTunes, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.